Hello and welcome to Media Watch on Hunger and Poverty. I'm your host, Bill Schickler, and during this holiday season, we want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah, a Happy New Year, and we would like to extend our prayers for peace to the Islamic community, as well as the communities of Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, and all kinds of religions around the world. In this program, we're going to be talking about events that we think are linked in Ferguson, Missouri, and New York City, how they have a historical antecedents back in the past. In particular, we're going to refer to an incident that happened in Philadelphia in 1964, where Roger Wilkins, who at the time was the head of the NAACP, asked for an investigation by the FBI that said that some of the riots happening then were being provoked by agents trying to discredit the civil rights movement. And then we want to see at the end of our program how all of this ties in with our country's founders. And we'll talk about some of the ideas that the architect of our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, had to say. But before we do that, on a personal note, I would just like to show those of you in the audience, you may know that I've been battling cancer. I had 2 cancer surgeries and 6 weeks of radiation. Well, they gave me this device, which I wear now. It's called a sensitivity 10. I use this electrical device to block pain because I have to take 2 strong muscle relaxers and then pain medication every 3 hours. And basically, I've been underwater for the last year trying to deal with the severe pain. So this new electrical device is intended to help me cut back on the narcotics that I've had to take, which have kept me underwater like Lloyd Bridges for the last year. So if I look like I've been groggy, that's why, because I have been groggy. But hopefully this electronic device will help cut down on my pain. And JFK, hopefully if I see you in heaven, we can compare notes on how we deal with pain. Okay, so much for the personal vignette. So getting to Ferguson. If we look at some of the graphics, you'll see behind me, and I think it's camera 4, I'm not sure, but we have a rotating loop of images that we've captured from all the activity that's been happening in Ferguson. And you can see a lot of things have been happening there, and it's very reminiscent of the civil rights era. And in a way, it's a complete rebirth of the civil rights era in this country. And this is a rebirth that's not just in Ferguson, Missouri, although most of these pictures are from Ferguson, Missouri. But recently, a person by the name of Eric Garner in New York was killed 90 days ago by a chokehold, and we'll get into that in a little while. But it's a nationwide phenomenon that's reacting to this militarization of the police, this violation of people's civil rights, and basically it's a repetition of history. History, it seems to be repeating itself. With Michael Brown's situation, for those of you who have been living in another planet somewhere, Michael Brown was the 18-year-old adult who just graduated and was getting ready to go to college, who was shot with his hands up by at least 18 witnesses, and that's where the hands up, don't shoot movement got started. A private autopsy, which was not allowed by this grand jury, showed that Michael Brown had been shot in the back, in addition to the top of his head twice. You can see these KKK members, they're trying to cool emotions. Yeah, that's close. The fact that these characters can still be allowed in, even anywhere in the vicinity, shows you that those are the real terrorists that we need to be concerned about. Homegrown terrorists that are right here. They're not talking about the Middle East. They're racist. And unfortunately, the sins of the father have been visited upon sons and daughters. There was a headline in the Washington Post, that's a picture there in 1965 of some civil rights marches in Montgomery. And the same thing is going on now. There's a headline in the Washington Post Express that said, will we as African Americans ever be treated as equal citizens? And you can see how things have been just ignored. I'd like to go into this in a way that hasn't been really handled by any of the media, just bits and pieces. First of all, people might not know what a grand jury is about. A grand jury is convened when they think that there is enough evidence that a trial should be held. A grand jury is not a trial. Okay, let's make that clear first of all. Convening a grand jury is not a trial. And in many states, including Missouri, you don't have to have a grand jury in order to indict someone, even a police officer, of murder, manslaughter, or any other crime. A prosecutor can go ahead and indict these people without a grand jury in most states, including Missouri. So the purpose of a grand jury is to see if sufficient evidence exists to convene a trial. Well, you might say, okay, well, evidently there was plenty of evidence in this situation, but you hear from various news sources, oh, well, we had witnesses that say that Michael Brown was charging this officer. Well, there's a lot of facts that you don't hear about so much. One of the facts is that, according to the police's own report, Michael Brown's body was found 180 feet away from the police car where this policeman shot him. And yet this policeman said in this interview with ABC News that Michael Brown came lunging at him and he was shooting at him when he was only 10 feet away. So he contradicted his own and the police's testimony in this grand jury proceeding. So a lot of facts don't come out. The fact that the family had an autopsy that wasn't evidently allowed into the public investigation showed that he was shot in the back. Why didn't we hear about this? Well, that's a good question. Another thing that people might not realize, and there's the police helicopter, we got a lot of footage. You can see that some media are pointing out the militarization of the situation really makes matters worse. Some people think that this is just a prelude to making a police state, which a lot of African Americans and Latinos have already been living in. But when you have armored personnel carriers and these devices that can project sound and who knows what else, other kinds of radiation out, they use these weapons in Iraq. So now where our domestic population is being treated like an enemy, a foreign enemy. There was this movement called the Posse Comitatus early in the history of the United States, and even the right-wingers will talk about this, saying that our army can't be used against the population unless martial law is declared. Well, they didn't declare martial law in this situation, and yet we have the National Guard, we have military equipment being used, and as you can see, they went nuts with this stuff. And this might be the prelude to a police state throughout the country, used not just on minorities, but middle-income people. Anybody who's not the richest 1% can be a target of these characters now. But getting back to this grand jury proceeding, people might not realize, this was in one of the networks reported this. Last year, nationwide, over 160,000 grand juries were convened. That means they had 160,000 grand juries formed to see if a trial should be allowed to take place as a result of some crime or what some people thought is a crime. And only 40 out of the 160,000, 40 cases more or less out of 160,000 did the grand jury decide not to go forward with the trial. Let me repeat that. Out of 160,000 grand jury convenings, formations of a grand jury to investigate a crime, out of 160,000, only 40 or so did they decide not to go ahead with the trial. And in Ferguson, Missouri, and also in New York City, where a man was killed with an illegal chokehold, those were 2 of the 40 or so nationwide and involved police killings. So this shows you something is not right in Dodge City. Okay, so we pointed out a grand jury proceeding is not a trial. You don't have lawyers for the deceased in this case. Supposedly the prosecutor is supposed to bring evidence to say we want to have a trial. But the problem in having local prosecutors involved in this is that they're the friends of the police on a day-to-day basis. They rely on the police for information. They ask the police to go after, drug czars or drug dealers or mafia or whatever. So they're buddy-buddy on a first-name basis with a lot of these police, and then you're going to ask them to indict their own friends. So after there's your KKK Nazi friends again. People might remember that in Los Angeles, in the Rodney King situation, they had a trial, and he was found not guilty by all these white people in Orange County, California. There's a real reactionary county in California. So the federal government brought charges and found this guy, the guy who killed Rodney King, beat him to death, guilty, and he's still in jail right now. So you can bring federal charges. But in that case, a special prosecutor was announced and formed and put forth by the federal authorities. And that's what you need I would say in every situation where there's a police killing, there should be a special prosecutor, because the prosecutors, the local prosecutors, are too close to the police themselves to ask them to bring charges against them. They act more like a defender of the police. They don't bring out the facts in a clear enough fashion. They don't highlight something that a defense attorney would say for the person that was killed, saying, hey, how come you didn't, you had 18 witnesses saying he had his hands up and only 2 saying they didn't. You didn't allow a private autopsy saying he got shot in the back. You didn't highlight the fact that there's 180 feet from the point where Michael Brown fell over dead from where the police car was, and you could see it on a video, 180 feet, as even the police showed. And then there's all I can say is it's a crime against humanity. This is something that should be taken to the World Court, of leaving a U.S. citizen's body in the street for 4 hours? This is something that causes the Watts Rebellion. This is something that caused, after Martin Luther King was killed, a righteous rage. And this is what's building in this country now. People have adopted a new thing in the wake of this militarization and overreaction of the police. And we're not saying that all police act this way, but there's Michael Brown, the demon, as they said. The new thing there is, I can't breathe. People are having die-ins and they're saying, I can't breathe, because he was put in a chokehold. And his dying words 4 times over, I can't breathe. On a videotape, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. How many times do you have to hear it? And then they don't indict, they don't have a trial go forth. What, they didn't believe what their lying eyes were seeing? So African Americans and Latinos have put up with this for a long time. But this has sparked nationwide outrage and a rebirth, I think, of a nationwide reemergence of the civil rights movement. These are the straws that broke the camel's back. And that's why this happened in August. People said, oh, well, after it's a headline news, everybody will go away. After warm weather goes, people will go away. No, they didn't go away. People are out there in Ferguson now, and it's freezing cold, bitter cold, and they're not going away. People in Oakland, California got arrested recently, and they're not going away. Los Angeles, California, they had 10 blocks long. People aren't going away. New York City, people walked across Manhattan all the way to the Bronx a couple weeks ago, followed by CNN. They're not going away. This is a movement now. And it's in all cities, large cities and small across the country. There you see even the New Yorker, a tabloid for the richest 1%. Here's Washington, D.C. in front of the district building. Demonstrations in New York, D.C., Oakland, Portland, Oregon, Los Angeles, Chicago, New Orleans, Philadelphia, Boston. This is truly a rebirth of the civil rights movement. And it recalls Rosa Parks in 1955, but she actually got started in 1940s. But her bus boycott was in 1955. In 1965, there was the action on the Pettus Bridge in Birmingham in Alabama. The bus boycott was in Montgomery, Alabama. 1963, we had the March on Washington. 1968, Martin Luther King was killed. So to show you that history is repeating itself, I'd like to show you this newspaper. It's from the 1964 Philadelphia Inquirer, August 31st, 1964, and you see these police beating an African-American club, and the headline says, "Police keep order in riot zone, cope with looters in other areas." And this was August 31st, 1964, 50 years ago. And the banner on the top here says, 50 years ago this week, in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And so you can see historically, those who don't learn from history were doomed to repeat it. But something that is very interesting in this is that there's a column where Roger Wilkins, who at the time was the head of the NAACP, the premier civil rights organization, along with the Southern Poverty Law Center, asked for an FBI federal probe of these riots, claiming that agent provocateurs, which are people who are paid to start riots and keep them going, had initiated these riots and kept them going in order to discredit the civil rights movement, and in order to portray them as just a bunch of hooligans and like they're talking about now in these police statements, all these thugs, when the Los Angeles Rams came out saying hands up, saying these protesters are thugs. That's the new word for the N-word. Now it's thugs. Well, they had 187 arrests in that situation. And the question I have is, if it was an agent provocateurs, do you think this was to possibly inflame racial tensions for Obama's last 2 years? That's just something to think about. So if we go to our bank on Thomas Jefferson, I'd like to end our program in talking about how this links up with one of the fathers of our country, Thomas Jefferson. And, you know, we have in Washington, D.C., there's the Jefferson Memorial. And Thomas Jefferson was one of the founders of the United States of America. You go down the Tidal Basin right there at 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C. As you come over from Virginia and the Pentagon, you see probably one of the most beautiful memorials at the Tidal Basin for Thomas Jefferson, one of the main authors of our Declaration of Independence. And he had many quotes talking about a law that is just should not only be disobeyed, and he also talked about how the government, we shouldn't, when the people fear the government, that's bad. When the government fears the people, that's good. And he talked about resistance. So what I would like to specifically relate this all to Ferguson is, if we could have a Thomas Jefferson quote, I'll read you this quote. Prudence indeed will dictate the governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce the people under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. And that's from Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, 1776. So there you have it. We, the people, when we've exhausted all the forms of this tyranny, it's not just our right, it's our duty to throw off these forms of tyranny and establish a new system that ensures our security as freedom-loving people. And that's the movement that's taking place right now in Ferguson, Missouri, and New York, and throughout the country, not only with African Americans and Latinos, people of color, but with women, with middle-class people who are fighting the richest 1%, and people opposed to the Wall Street domination, the richest 1% ruling this country in a feudal-like manner. Now, I know that it's the Christmas season. I don't want to leave all of us with a bitter and rancorous, hopeless taste in our mouths. So I'd like to offer some quick messages of hope here in the Christmas, Kwanzaa, New Year is coming. I just point out that in the past, in World War II, it was just 70 years ago, we were stuffing people into ovens and killing them by the millions. The Jewish Holocaust. We're done with it. The slave trade, in which millions, even more worse than the Holocaust, millions of people were killed and then brought into slavery for 200 years here in this country. That's over with. That will never happen again. We now have an international community of sorts, so that when there's disasters around the world, we have international relief. We have the United Nations. Prior to World War II, this did not exist. Smallpox is a disease which used to ravage the earth as one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, has been destroyed from the face of the earth. Polio is almost wiped out. And we've reduced the number of nuclear arms by a factor of 10. So I would just say in closing, yes, we have a terrible dilemma on our hands. That's the truth. But there's always hope. Things have been worse in the past. So all I would like to leave you with is pray for peace, pray for truth. Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah. Let there be peace on earth for our Muslim brothers, Buddhist brothers, our Vedic brothers, Hindu brothers and sisters. I'm Bill Schickler, Media Watch on Hunger and Poverty. See you next year.